My PowerPoint won't be as interactive as Dominic's was. I'd pick out actually a few things that you said that are very relevant to this. And Claudio saying that I've come into bat. You mentioned Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. When I played cricket, my style of batting was described as Hobbes' description of human life, of nasty, brutish and short. Interestingly, on the rugby field too. I started my postgraduate career at Aberystwyth, and your mention of civil wars taking off feeds straight in to this narrative. Many of you will be aware of this narrative, the narrative that could be loosely called Ivory and insurgency, of proceeds from ivory poaching, feeding insurgency in Africa and keeping it going. And it developed really in around about 2011, 2012, with an article written by a group called the Elephant Action League, called The White Gold of Jihad. And it purported to show, and I have to say, at first reading, it was very beguiling. And I began to look into it and felt maybe there was something there. And what they argued was that the Al-Shabaab movement in Somalia, which had become very powerful in the wake of the clan conflicts that followed the overthrow of the military dictator Siad Barre, that the clan conflicts had then been, to an extent, only an extent, reduced by the rise of a movement called the movement of the Islamic Courts, the Islamic Courts Union. And they began to establish, at least in a very conservative, very harsh way, what you could call a rudimentary rule of law within areas of Somalia. But of course they were an Islamist-inspired movement. They were not to the taste of the United States government, and importantly also the government in Ethiopia. And in 2006, the Ethiopians invaded at the behest of America and with backing, military supplies and funding from America, launched an invasion and destroyed, as a political movement, the Union of Islamic Courts. Their youth wing, and you could say their nascent military wing, was Al-Shabaab. And they became the movement that gained territory, used Islamist ideas, adhered broadly to the ideas of Al-Qaeda, and became a serious force and took over large areas of Somalia. They were also active in areas of northern Kenya, where there was a Somali population, and with the long-held view of many Kenyan Somalis and many in Somalia, that the northern areas of Kenya should be part of a larger Somalia. So Kenya was involved. And Al-Shabaab was seen as part of the global Islamist threat to the international order. This article, The White Gold of Jihad, said that 40% of the cost of Al-Shabaab's military wing was being met by ivory income from poached ivory. Now, it wasn't clear quite how this could be, but EAL said they had phone tap and informant information. And they put on their website in this article excerpts from conversations supposedly tapped that showed, or purported to show, that ivory dealers in Kenya would be contacted by Al-Shabaab operatives in the port of Kismayu, which Al-Shabaab at the time controlled in southern Somalia, who were supplying ivory to foreign buyers. It was being shipped out from Kismayu either to the Gulf or straight on to the Far East, with China probably as the main ultimate destination. And so the idea was, from this very small amount of phone tap information, that Al-Shabaab would get ivory from Kenya. And the suggestion was that poachers would be commissioned to poach. They would supply to Al-Shabaab's contacts in Kenya, who would get the ivory out through Somalia, and it would then go out through Kismayo. And it seemed plausible. It seemed possible until you looked at the figures. And a number of researchers, I mean, Ros Duffy has looked into it, Kathy Heinlein at RUSI and Tom Maguire, Dan Stiles, based in Kenya, who knows the Kenyan ivory trade extremely well, Lucy Vine in Kenya, among others, and the late Esmond Bradley Martin had a look at it as well. And they began to come to the conclusion that there is no way that Al-Shabaab could get that much money from ivory from Kenya, because Kenya is a route for ivory coming out of Africa from Uganda, possibly a little from northern Tanzania, further afield from South Sudan, DRC, and going out through Mombasa, which is one of the main smuggling hubs on the east coast of Africa. So there's clearly ivory going out through Kenya, but if Al-Shabaab was to get this amount of money to fund 40% of the cost of manning its army from ivory, they would be having to get practically every tusk going out through Kenya. Every single tusk poached in Kenya and a lot of the other tusks, and it didn't add up. It also didn't add up because others who have investigated Al-Shabaab have talked much more about the charcoal industry, which is their main source of money, and their taxing of all sorts of trades and smuggling that was going on across the Kenya-Somalia border. Things like smuggling large amounts of sugar. So there seemed to be a flaw in this. And I was in the process of writing a book on humans and elephants, and particularly the exploitation of elephants, published as Ivory, Power and Poaching in Africa. And I contacted the Elephant Action League and their main voice, Andrea Croster. He wouldn't be interviewed by telephone or Skype, so we had a long email conversation. And as the emails went along, he progressively moved the goalposts. Every time I pinned him down on, well, you said 40%. Well, maybe not 40%. Maybe a little bit less. And only the manpower, not the arms. Yes, but are you getting all the ivory from Kenya? Well, we never directly said that. Well, they actually did at first. We are also getting it from Tanzania and the DRC. So I said, well, how is it that these established smuggling networks for ivory from East Africa, huge amounts coming out of that time from Tanzania, 60% of Tanzania's elephants lost in under a decade, large amounts coming out from the DRC, from Garamba, and also forest elephants from elsewhere in the Congo Basin, some ivory coming out from South Sudan, possibly some from the Central African Republic. How come the syndicates that make millions upon millions from this would suddenly let Al-Shabaab have this ivory at a price, and it had to be at a very low price, that would enable them to fund this insurgency? And it began to fall apart. Dan Stiles looked at it and said the figures really do not add up. They cannot be getting this amount of money. It's just impossible. Others said the same. A RUSI study. And in a way, you'd have expected RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, very close to the armed forces, traditionally a little on the conservative side, to actually look seriously at something that suggested an Islamist group that were destabilizing in an important region of the world were getting ivory. But Kathy Heinlein and Tom Maguire looked at it forensically, and they could not find the link. They too found what I found when I questioned Croster, that the numbers didn't add up. But in the meantime, this had gained traction as a new narrative of the ivory trade. It was even taken up at a session of the Foreign Relations Committee of Congress, where many of the great and good of the elephant conservation world went along and said, yes, this seems to be holding water. Ian Douglas Hamilton thought at first that it was pretty reliable and quite likely. Various others went along. Political leaders, including Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, really jumped on this and said, yes, we have got to put money into forms of anti-poaching that also combat insurgency, which is a very dangerous link. The militarization of anti-poaching is something that has to be really questioned. And is very, actually, Francis has just walked in, somebody who knows a lot about the militarization of anti-poaching. These things have got to be questioned and put under the microscope. Interestingly, a few years later, as I was still researching the book, I spoke to Ian Douglas Hamilton at length, and he was moving back. He said, no, actually, there isn't that evidence we thought there was. And this began to crumble. At the same time, let's go back a bit. There was another narrative developing. Now, this one is more realistic, but it is not necessarily related to insurgency. The Janjaweed, and as many of you probably know, the name Janjaweed literally just means men on horseback. It is the name that was applied during the hideously brutal Darfur conflict. The name applied to the Baghara and Rizagat Arabs of Darfur, who became an informal militia for the Sudanese government fighting Darfur rebels. They were paid and armed, but also given free rein, almost like sort of equivalents of the old privateers or pirates of the sort of 17th and 18th century. They had license to loot. If they were sent in to wipe out rebels in one area of Darfur, they would take their cattle, their camels. They would even, and it still exists there, sell people into slavery. Traditionally, these people, the Baghara and Rizagat, had been long-distance traders in the Sahel. They had assisted the Nile Valley Arab elite to spread their trading networks up the Nile into what is now South Sudan and Uganda in the 19th century. And what were they after then? They were after gold, ivory, and slaves. So they had a history. When they fought for the government as a militia, ivory was not part of it. But they are involved in the ivory trade. When there was a huge slaughter of elephants in Bubarangida in Cameroon in 2012, something like 300 to 400 elephants were killed in the space of a couple of weeks. The finger seems to be pointing very strongly, with lots of evidence, at the Janjaweed. They were that mobile, they could move right across, going back to the original slide, right across from Darfur. Oh my God, see, nasty, brutish and short, I can't even reach up there. From Darfur, they were involved in Chad, in Central African Republic, and up into the north of Cameroon. Poaching, smuggling, and not just smuggling ivory, but smuggling stolen cattle, drugs, weapons. They were part of a wide and long-standing smuggling network. They were not using ivory to fund insurgency, but they got wrapped into the whole thing. So that added to the weight of it. They were certainly involved in events in Chad, in poaching in Zakuma, the main southern national park in Chad, in the Central African Republic, particularly in the lead up to the overthrow of the government by the Seleka rebels, and then afterwards. And I was told by a French military officer who had worked in the Central African Republic in anti-poaching in Sangazanga that Seleka were involved in ivory, but again, it was enriching Seleka leaders rather than funding an insurgency. Let's move forward. This was originally a longer presentation to MSc students at the University of Kent a couple of weeks ago. Now, the other group that are involved in a small way in ivory is the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, formerly based and carrying out their insurgency in northern Uganda. About 12 years ago, they were pushed out and pushed into southern Sudan, South Sudan, what was then still the autonomous province of South Sudan within the wider Sudan is now the independent state of South Sudan. And there was insurgency there, the South Sudanese, the SPLA, fighting the Sudanese government, a peace agreement in 2005, but it didn't end violence between various militias that had grown up during the SPLA's war against the Sudanese government. And the LRA moved into the area. They, in one of these geopolitical tit-for-tat games that often happen, they received support from the government in Khartoum. Not because the government in Khartoum had any particular liking for them or their ideology, but the Ugandan government of Yoweri Museveni had supported the SPLA and was close to some of the SPLA leaders. So the government in Khartoum was quite happy to support a movement that would damage the Ugandan government. But when the LRA was pushed out, they moved into southern Sudan and then were pushed out further into the Central African Republic and the DRC. And they were fragmented. And they now still exist, maybe 300 to 400 possibly. Of them, maybe 150, 200 fighters, not that well armed. They are not a serious insurgent movement. They're almost like, they remind me of the book Mother Courage and Her Children, Grimmelshausen's account of people pushed from pillar to post during the 30 Years' War, 1615 to 1645 in Europe. They're almost like a remnant of a movement who are now bandits surviving by stealing cattle, stealing food, abducting people, and a tiny amount of ivory poaching and smuggling. They are able to get their ivory out. They have a small group still in Garamba National Park, others in the Zamongo Forest of CAR. Joseph Kony, the leader of the LRA, is up in this strange little enclave called Kafiakingi. It's legally part of South Sudan, but it is still occupied by the Sudanese government, and it stations large amounts of troops there. Kony still gets some residual support from them, and he sells the ivory that his men poach and smuggle up from Garamba or Zimongo through into Kafiakingi. That ivory is sold on, it is believed, by the Sudanese army, which has always had a role. The final one, which I'll move to very, very quickly, is Boko Haram. This has begun to arise as a new narrative, that Boko Haram, the Islamist movement of northeastern Nigeria, is involved in ivory smuggling. It appears to have its origins in the desire of people, particularly in Gabon, not to admit that poaching of elephants, particularly in Minkebi, the park in northern Gabon, is carried out by Gabon nationals and by Cameroonians. And therefore, it is good to distance it and say, look, you've got to help us, you've got to help militarize our anti-poaching efforts because it's Boko Haram. Like Al-Shabaab in Kenya, which was a good way of getting Western governments to go beyond concern for conservation and mix it with concerns for security, you get the Boko Haram link. Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, probably vying with Chris Grayling to be the most incompetent man in the cabinet, and it's a hard fight there, really hard fight. When he was announcing British troops to go to Gabon and Malawi to train anti-poaching units in military techniques from counterinsurgency tactics developed in Afghanistan, yeah, that's really applicable to Gabon and Malawi. He used the Boko Haram version. And I was told by Lee White, who heads Gabon's national parks, that, oh yeah, there's definitely a link. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, well, I can't really tell you. It was almost one of those conversations, if I tell you, I'll have to have you killed. But he said, what I can tell you is the Cameroon army is involved. But don't say that publicly. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Keith. So can I just see if I get your main message? I mean, this idea of blaming other nationalities, I mean, for instance, in Southeast Asia, Vietnamese poachers are blamed for, a lot. But is your message then that the key message being it's an oversimplification to do that, and especially to then use that to advocate militarization type tactics? In the absence of that, what then would be your strategy for combating poaching?
Well, yes, it does. It justifies greater militarization. Western governments and some Western NGOs can almost find a perfect storm in this. You've got these horrible people killing elephants, and they are also these even more horrible people who are insurgents destabilizing the region. They're evil Islamists, the equivalents of Osama bin Laden or Islamic State. Perfect storm. We've got to oppose them. We can do that because they're heavily armed by militarization. But it has another angle, and that angle is covering over the role of corrupt politicians, officials, police, even, I have to say, some wildlife departments in poaching and smuggling. So Uhuru Kenyatta, at the time of the Westgate Mall attack, said this was funded by Ivory. Well, no, it wasn't. But that then became a way of diverting from, well, how do we actually treat the Somalis in Kenya? Well, not very well, and you never have done. They've always been, they're the bad guys. You find someone to blame, some other to blame for the problem. Not only do you then distance that from who within your own institutional system may be to blame, but you can also use it to elicit foreign support that might otherwise, people might be sympathetic, but you may not get the boots on the ground and the funding that you'll get if you could tie ivory poaching to insurgency.